Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. What it actually does, it looks in around at geopolitics, the world that we all actually often don't see, but it affects everything that we do, because it's how our countries interact with the rest of the world, and it's how the powers that be in our countries function at a level that we, as individuals, often don't see, but often pay the price for. So I just want to do a quick and dirty critical thinking sort of issue today, on which I want to look at how, in the past, things that we would think were, I guess you're really saying sort of science fiction, were kind of put in place by agencies, by groups, by countries that when they were falling down or were no longer capable of running the system that they ran or were running, what they do to survive, regardless of what it meant. And I want to look at two things, really. I want to look at the white regime in South Africa, because I think that's quite an interesting analysis on where they were going and how the connections were made back in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, actually. How that regime was trying to control what it might well have perceived as the inevitable. And you could see that there is a kind of a synergy with today and the State of Israel, and how it was set up really as a Jewish state. But of course, actually, in many ways, particularly those on the left, had, sort of open ideas about bringing, to some extent, the original Palestinian population into play, those who originally created the kibbutzim, etc., etc., and then how that was usurped by the more powerful bodies that came in and wanted to keep it as a state just for the Jewish people, rather than to share the state with its original inhabitants. So if I speak about the South African issue, you can probably see how it feeds into today. And I'm probably not going to go too much into the Israeli situation right now, because I just want to concentrate on the South African issue, so you can probably get a better understanding of it. So if we go back to really the Cape of Good Hope, and when most of those who would today call themselves Afrikaner, it's not true, but that's what they'd say, most of them would kind of wish to trace their ancestry to the Dutch settlers which landed on the Cape of Good Hope back in the 17th century, 1600 and whatever it might have been. And I guess that those individuals would have said, we're looking for a new land. There was a religious zeal to it, as there was with the Americas, and as it's depicted, as it's said, that original religious zeal didn't really intend on exterminating any peoples in the country which we now call South Africa, which they were going to kind of take control over. Now, there's a lot of history aspects to it that people say it's the Khoi people who had it, the Khoi people who had it, which later you get people calling them various other names, Hottentots, Bushmen, whatever. But the other argument would be from the Bantu peoples is that the Bantu peoples are also there. Yes, there were later movements from the more northern areas into the south, but it would be argued that the Bantu were always there and had populated that area as well. So that's the people who maybe the Ntabili, Shona, whatever, people like that, Zulu, that they were already there as well in that what later would become the Union of South Africa. So you've got that aspect, and so you have the European coming in, and the European then actually, just like in America, to be fair, when you take a look at the East Coast of America, and the first British people who went there after the Dutch, who also went there and formed New Amsterdam, and then it obviously became New York subsequently when the British came through. What you had a people who weren't adapted or weren't really capable of living in that land as Europeans. So therefore, exactly the same with the Native Americans, and a glorified story of Thanksgiving and a unifying story of Thanksgiving where, local indigenous people aided those individuals who had come from outside and, give them turkeys and taught them how to live, blah, blah, blah. Well, you actually get the same kind of story, to be fair, in South Africa, because the original Dutch who went out there, the Boer, the farmers who went out there, they were, frankly, not capable of living in the land. And it was then the Khoikhoi people who taught them how to live the land. And indeed, what subsequently wouldn't be a popular thing when the system of apartheid, which is basically racial hierarchical splits, came about, is that then nobody wanted the real history to be told. So really what happened is that in most cases, the European males in particular, but also some females, with male, bred with the local people, I'll put it that way. I guess there's some rape going on. I guess there was some, general relationships going on. Bred with the locals and basically survived. So learnt that survival, learnt those techniques, and then at a later stage you'll see them pushing away from those locals, which they would later call Cape Collards and people like that, who they would argue are not fully, were never fully given the top level of a white person, but were superior to the darker skinned Bantu, of which other type that could be, Bantu speakers. In the hierarchical system, what was put in place prior to and later in the apartheid era. And the reasoning for that is quite simple, and it's always the case, is that if you're in the minority, what you don't want to do, you don't want a majority to come together. So you wouldn't want to class all of the lighter skinned non-white people as the same, because then you'd have a big problem because they'd overrun you. And so what you want to do is you want to split and classify and classify and classify and classify. So you've got lesser people to fight with if you have to control your area. Plus, more importantly, you can usurp and co-opt some of these other peoples that you were saying are different, particularly the lighter skinned ones, the mixed race ones, the Cape Collards, whatever you want to call these people. You can co-opt them to your side for the period that's required for you to take over, and then, frankly, throw them away. But throw them away with the perspective that you've already told them that they're superior to the other darker skinned people, or the other people who are not whatever white is, but lighter skinned. And therefore you can then utilize them in a fashion that allows you to keep control and call on them whenever they're required, because they've also been bred into them then, educated into them then, that they are superior to the other darker people, and the darker ones are superior to the other less darker people, and it goes on and on and on. And you can stratify that all the way through to keep control, and that's a very, very important factor. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is, you can see that in the state of Israel today, and obviously Jewish people come first, but then oftentimes it's white Jewish people come first, and then you might have a little bit of a darker Jewish person, and then, you know, down the bottom you may have the falasha, the darker Jewish people, who they would argue actually trace their lineage much closer to Judaism than the Eastern European Jewish person. But anyway, that's not the way that the demarcation's been made. But it's made very clear that they're all Jewish because you need the numbers, and you need them to be able to fight in the army, and you need them to come up against what then is made to be the enemy, which is the indigenous Palestinian people. And then you even split them down, because you have people who live within Jewish areas who you can call Palestinian Israelis, who to some extent have a second-class nature. And then you can have Israelis who are, you know, Bedouin Israelis, who are oftentimes in the army, who don't see themselves as Palestinian, but more Bedouin, but really also indigenous to the land, and so on. So you can work it to your advantage. And this stratifying of individuals is always good for people coming in who want to control the indigenous people. And it also is a good strategy for when you leave but still want to control if you were an indigenous. So I'm talking now more of an imperial power, because if you stratify people enough, in the end they begin to believe what you've said, a la Tutsi and Hutu, and you can control them by that, and indeed have them kill each other in the end, so you can take and steal their resources. So depending upon how you do it, and you've got long enough there, you've got 100 years to do it in, or 200 years to do it in, you know, 300, you can go on forever, you know. So an example of that would be in the United States, that the Latinos, particularly Mexicans, have had, I think, 5 or 6 different classifications. They were white, non-white, black, non-white, and some Latino can now still be white and Latino. So depending upon when the states needed them, they've been stratified in different areas like that. Not solely based on skin color, but based that they're meant to be Latino. So you can have a Latino who's black, but he's meant to be a Latino. So therefore, you know, historically, you could argue under the American census systems that he was black. Now, they did that with Egyptians at one stage, calling them black, and at another stage, you know, Egyptian Americans, another stage then calling them white, because obviously falling into the historical element of Egypt, it was difficult to keep them as black, because then you'd be saying Egypt was black, even though they were black, you know. So they stratified it. This is what you get, and this is how you get control. At one stage, mulatto, as they would call them, mixed-race people, were given a different level, and then thereafter were given a different level, but created in the South in particular as black, because they had the one drop of blood law in some southern states. So 1 drop of black blood, you were black, because of course there were more white people there, so you didn't need to stratify them in that same way. So this is the understanding of South Africa. And the reason why I'm coming back with this is because South Africa is still suffering from this. It's still suffering from this perspective, and it will never really come to its true Rainbow Nation advantage if it doesn't get rid of this stratification. Legally, you're not meant to give these stratifications, but they do that within the people's minds, because that has been cast within them. And particularly in the Bantustans, people that would have originally been in Bantustans areas, the South Africans said, the white African regime said, okay, they've got their own homeland and they live there, and they only come into our white areas to work. This is under apartheid system. But also it was already been put in when the British were in control after the Boer War, 1901 to 3, I believe. And the British controlled South Africa after Cecil Rhodes suggested that one should come into South Africa because of the wealth that is there, all of the gold that needed to be exploited. And he said to Britain, look, what you can exploit, gold, but you name it, it's there in South Africa. You know, mineral wealth, diamonds, you know, massively. So first came the commerce and then came the British military to keep the commerce when the commerce was beginning to be lost, particularly to, by then, the maybe 100, potentially 200-year-old Boer who had been there, which is why I call it the Boer War. It's these Dutch who are coming up against them. But these Dutch are actually mixed race, but then, of course, they don't want to say they're mixed race anymore. So they're not mixed race, but they are mixed race. And if you really were to scratch a Boer and go back in time, you're going to come back to, as I said before, to what they would call the Hottentot, to the Khoi people. You're going to come back to that minimum. You might even come back to some other peoples who happen to be what has been classified subsequently as Bantu-speaking peoples as well. So, because frankly, like, as I said before, like in the Americas, again, that was one of the biggest problems you had with Southern Americans. If you scratched them too deeply, you'd see that there was some mixed in their family, and that had been throughout. So this is the problem with the racial nonsense that one has in many states that create themselves based on a race, white or black or whatever it might be. You have that problem whereby if you look very, very closely, this is the same in India, it's the same all over the world, to be fair. If you look too closely, you will see the peoples that they don't like. So the Dravidian people, example, are looked down upon by the Northern Indian. But if you look closely within the Northern Indian, you'll see that there's a Dravidian background to it. And indeed, the Dravidian people were the ones who created much of the cultural aspect of ancient India. So you get all these connections, but particularly after the slave trade, the black slave trade, because obviously there's been slave trading forever and a day of all different types of people, and the word slave comes from Slav, so it's not wasn't attached to a colour until the 1492, really more about 15 odd connection, when people started saying it was based on colour, African colour. So, so actually, what I should say is, why am I talking about South Africa at all? Because within the South African system right now, as we stand, there is violence going on with South Africans, which is by far the strongest economy in Southern Africa. They're trying to kick out people who come from other parts of Africa for the pure and simple reason what they're arguing is the average South African black person, whatever that means, terms black person of colour, is arguing that these other people from other parts of Africa are stealing their jobs, their women, etc., etc. Haven't you heard that before? So they're arguing that. So what they're trying to do is kick them out, and they put a particular ethos or emphasis on Nigerians. Now, Nigeria potentially has the whole potential to overrun South Africa with its capacity in terms of what it has, in terms of its peopling and the economic and educational skills, and of course the assets back in Nigeria. So it's by no means a foolish place, and many Nigerians tend to create business in South Africa, etc. But of course, then the South African who hasn't created business for whatever reason then wants to burn out the Nigerian or others, Ghanaian or whomever, who has created business, because their argument is they're taking our work from us, as I said before. So you can see how racism plays in a very strange area, because what it really is about power, not solely about the colour of one's skin or race or whatever. And I bring this because I'm going to tie the United Kingdom into this as well, in the dangers that we are now having when we start leaving the flags of St. George all over the place. And the irony being that, of course, that St. George was at least a Turkish person, and at that, a black Turkish person, and the degree of blackness is up to you, whatever you perceive as black. So that's the strangeness about that process, that we've got all these flags saying that you don't belong here and you're not indigenous to here. And, I think somebody just came out quite recently about saying, we only take people as proper English who have been here for 4 generations. Now, that argument's meant to suggest that if you've been here for 4 generations in Britain, then you were before the Windrush, and hence before black people came and the whole countryside was white. Well, people who listen to the show know I've stated and proved that this is a whole load of nonsense, from the recreation of Cheddar Man, which is the oldest Englishman, and his recreation by English people recreating it in the university in Manchester, and I think Goethe as well, university, coming together to create it. And he's a very dark-skinned, curly-ish herd European, who is the first Englishman that they've able to pull out of the ground. But if you forget all that even, and you come into Roman era, and then people say, but there weren't that many blacks in the Roman era. Well, there were, because there weren't that many English people in England at all, in Britannia. There weren't that many. So again, the numbers that were brought in were actually large numbers. Plus, of course, many of the blacks were either soldiers or merchants, or wealthier people often. So basically what you've got, particularly under Septimus Severus, who was an African himself from North Africa, which at that time was a very much darker place in terms of colour than it is today, a blacker place than it is today, because they didn't have the sways of people coming into North Africa that changed the colouring of the North African, because they're now a fully mixed race people in general, rather than a blacker people, which they were previously. So, the movement of these people into Britain under the Roman era was actually quite strong. And as I said to you before, even in America back in the 19th century, Italians were being classed as blacks initially under the American census. They only changed that when they felt that more whites were required, so they made Italians white. So this is how you can move around with what colour is. That's the nonsense that I always say, the total and utter biological nonsense of race. However, as I state just as powerfully, it's a total and utter political reality. So it's biologically stupid, but politically it is what it is, and there's no way around that process presently. May well be in time to come. So back on the line of South Africa. So now you've got this South African situation where, people are being killed in the street, people are being burnt out of their shops. The government even is playing a racist card by saying, we will not provide these individuals that have been burnt out with actually some a compensation for their actions. They're actually allowing people to say, let them fly back to Nigeria or to wherever they came from. So the government's playing the racist card of South Africa as well. And so this is what I mean with this racial aspect. It can be very, very fluid, and it just because it's about power, and one utilises the power that's been provided to you. But it always is, and I'll say it always is, and I'll say it again, always is a hide into nothing. It's a negative aspect, because you can create it for a politician, this anger, this deception of who is really belongs there and who doesn't. But in the end, it always gets out of control. And when it gets out of control, it's open season on everybody. And the nation is the one that loses out. The nation loses out. And as I say, this is what you're seeing in Israel. You're seeing that the right wing are coming to such an extent now that they're talking about exterminating everybody who isn't Jewish. So you see, you have that problem with the right, the religious right. There's a reason for it. Religion tells us we need to do it. You saw it in Rwanda. Religion says we should do it. Get rid of these people. Religion's telling us. So you have these precepts that are put in place by people purposefully at one stage to control the masses. When they leave, then it gets out of hand, because you wanted them to control the masses, that they wouldn't be an effective tool against you. And don't get me wrong, it's not new. So we know that in the Treaty of Berlin in 1884, under Bismarck, and it was set in Berlin. They got together and the Europeans decided what parts of Africa they cut up for each other. And the reason for the treaty was that they don't fight each other while trying to steal African product. So they do that, and the King of Belgium gets his own area, the Congo. He puts in, says, I should have something, so he gets the Congo. Massive place, 8 times the size of, if not more, of Belgium. But what he does is, because he wants to exploit wealth very quickly rather than some of the others who are exploiting wealth over a longer period of time. This is the king, by the way, who's running it, not the country fully. So the king wants to exploit because he's overspent, basically, cut a long story short. So he lets, what I can only say is Einsatzgruppen, no different than the Nazis, going in to Congo, and Congo basically has a population loss then because of the extermination, because of the absolute and utter cruelty between 1889 and 1902, I think it is, maximum of that period of time. So around about the same sort of time of the Nazi era, to be fair. You have annihilation, a genocide of 11 million Congolese people. Nobody ever speaks about it. Nobody, because nobody cares, because it was Africans. So these Belgians, and Belgium doesn't have a bad name for it. Belgian people don't have to feel sad or sorry for it like the Germans do. No, nobody cares. So they exterminate 11 million people. Now, that's only the crux of the matter. Because what they also did is, because they want people to work, they basically chop off the hands of people who don't work enough. They chop off the leg of somebody who doesn't work enough. They chop off both hands if they don't work. And then somebody starts saying, well, if you're chopping off both hands, how can they work? So it's right, okay, let's chop 2 legs off and let them crawl and do the work. Whatever they need to do. But we also need to make people absolutely fearful of us, because that's how you control systems. You make people absolutely fearful so they don't do something negative. So when people fight back, they get exterminated horribly, and you do that to the individuals. So for the 11 million exterminated, I would imagine that you'd have also another 4 or 5 million who were basically handicapped by the system. Purposefully made to be less able than what they were. So disabled, purposefully, by the system. And of course that lasted between that period of time, but it didn't stop then. The Europeans chided the Belgian king because it meant that others in other parts of Africa were laying up greater resistance, because they said, this is what the white guy does. He's chopping the hands off, killing individuals when they start hearing about this. And so they say, let's get rid of him. So they don't want that. So they say, oh, you're going over the top, King of Belgium. You cannot have that. So they take it off the king personally and they give it to the Belgian people, who actually go about exterminating people as well, but to a lesser extent. But they're still doing the same because that's what they've learned to do. And that's what they've orientated the local indigenous people to do on their behalf. So this continues as long as you get the rubber out and you get the gold out and whatever else is out of the ground, great. You can top a lot of people. You make your own private money, you bring it back to Belgium, you're wealthy back in Europe. And so, and you've already desensitized them because they've been there chopping people up forever and a day. The Belgian leading elite, or the Belgian Chancellor, who's got nothing in Belgium, goes over to Congo, starts killing a lot of people at the behest of the government, and then obviously makes his own money because everything he gets he puts in his back pocket. So this is how it works. So, but what I've tried to explain to you using the South African angle is that it isn't only on colour. Now let's do a little bit more of a deep dive. How when you move forward into the more technical eras that we've got. So resistance comes in 1913. You form the African National Congress. Then I think it's probably about probably earlier, but I'd say that definitely by 1920 you form the Contour Sizwe, which is the armed wing of the South African resistance movement. The ANC, African National Congress, comes about, and you have resistance to South Africa. as a white regime, because of course now they're starting to push people in place. Now this is still under British rule, by the way. Understand that. This is not yet under Dr. Verwoerd after World War II, where he then makes apartheid as a body. This is before that. So under British rule, you have people moved out of certain areas. They couldn't live. Mixed families couldn't live in certain areas, moved about, and had white only areas. And so that was what was happening in South Africa. And then you brought people in from places who could run things, and you'd have control over the blacks who were doing the actual work. And of course, you force them to work because no money, no food. And if you found people loitering around in the cities or even in the countryside who weren't working, they could be arrested and things like that. So this is how you get people to work for you. So you get this work labour force that you require, and that keeps running through. So you get the First World War. Some of them go out to fight, some of the blacks in South African army, and you get the Second World War, and the blacks go out to fight in the South African army with whites, of course. And again, they're coming back with different ideals, saying, why are we allowing this to happen? And obviously they're fighting for their freedom. So, and I'm doing this quite quickly because I don't want the episode to go on too long, but I just want to give you a feel because of what's happening in South Africa right now. So what you then get is, and because it actually gives you an overview for what's happening in many other places, and it takes away some of the racial aspects, because you can see it's people on people, their own people on own. Well, they're not their own people, but people from a nation who's a similar colouring or lighter or darker colouring going against others, purely and simply because that's what they've been brought up to do under a system that lasted over 300 years. You want to do it all the way, but actually with real power, 120, 130 years, starting under the British power to be able to control these individuals. So, because they no longer needed to deal with the locals, because they were now superior to the locals, armed, latest weaponry, etc., etc. But then you had a numbers problem. So you had situations whereby, and I think I've spoken about Colonel Coetzee before, who argued under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they had the Witdukke, which would go around and paint the underpants of black and Congolese fighters in order to only exterminate them. That they had created what they believed would be a sickle cell orientated, quick working bioweapon that would only kill black people. So this is what it leads to when you start to become and believe in total superiority, and then believe in actually controlling your state. And you think that in order to control my state, I need to do everything that's possible. And we could talk about the Second World War with Great Britain, Americans and Russians, Soviets. We could talk about that, about what people are willing to do once it's existential. And the reason why I'm bringing this whole issue up is because things become, actually, without you even knowing, existential to a state quite quickly. And it can lead to big problems because you're now not thinking about the cost to others, you're thinking about the cost of your state and the loss of your state. Even if that state's new to you, imagine when that state is 5,000-6,000 years old and it's been your state for 5,000-6,000 years, not just 150 years or 200 years. So you're willing to do almost anything to retain that state. And that's the dangers that you get. And so today was a matter of using South Africa in order to show that. So what the South Africans did is, it made sense to them. They created a nuclear bomb with the aid of the Israelis. Because, of course, they weren't going to let any of the newly freed African countries around them take over, and they'd drop a nuclear bomb if it were necessary. Now, it wasn't a sophisticated bomb, it's not a fissile material bomb, but it was a nuclear bomb nevertheless, and the idea was that it would spread a radiation and kill a lot of people if it were necessary. Now, it was never used, and when from inside to outside, and that's where the problem lies, when the the apartheid system crumbled from the activities inside, and of course from the ANC going out around the rest of the world and making sure that people didn't buy South African goods, etc., 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 and really got to the bones of the people, not just the blacks, the whites as well, South Africans who went that way. Then, of course, what you're going to use a nuclear bomb on? Your own people? It doesn't make any sense. Or in their own areas, more in like they would have obviously used it against black South Africans, would be no problem. But to use it against white South Africans and to use it in areas where the whites themselves would become infected by the nuclear fallout didn't make any sense, and this is where it falls down. But what was made sure, for one, was part of the deal to put the Nelson Mandela government into place was that he would get rid of his nuclear weapons. So South Africa did that. They got rid of their nuclear weapons because, of course, the other countries who saw that, they didn't want a black state with nuclear weapons. You know, where is it going to go? Are they going to hand it to other states? Blah, blah, blah. So you can see how that worked in that way. But short of that, the South African state was happy to use anything, anywhere, anytime, whatever came to them in order to destroy both, you know, their own blacks and blacks in Angola, in Mozambique, in Botswana, in wherever the ANC was congregating. They were happy to do whatever was necessary in order to prevent that coming to fruition, whereby they would be overthrown by the black government. And even at the end of the day, when it was all coming to naught, there were people like Eugene Terreblanche, Trianicht, and individuals like that who were from the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, who were, you know, saying, we'll fight to the death. We'll fight to the death. We're not going to have these people running us. And for a time, to be fair, in upcountry, in some areas, and actually even today, you'll find that supporters of these individuals have whites-only places in South Africa. I mean, the government doesn't go at them because the government isn't 100% sure what its own people will do, the whites within the system will do, or the bad press that it will pick up from places like the United States and relative sympathisers like President Trump, example. What would they do if we went against these white-only areas? So, frankly, the government of South Africa doesn't do very much about them. And of course, to be fair, let's be totally realistic, although there are now many more poor whites, frankly, most of the wealthy whites who were wealthy before remain wealthy, and therefore they don't want to rock the boat either. So we get that position. And of course, if the blacks are then having that anger turned on them against other blacks who are coming in, the poor blacks that is, who are coming into South Africa, why would we sort of show ourselves and take some action that they think they're going to come against us? So you've got that, the machinations and that machinery working in that way. So what was today about in closing? Today was really about actually showing to you that you can, if you will, lift the cork off a systematic system that can be of absolute detriment to your nation if you play into those for political reasoning. And I mentioned a couple of countries that are already doing that, which would include the United States and the United Kingdom. You know, France is talking about that process. Countries that forever and a day, as I've said to you, blacks have been in Britain for 2,000 years. They've been in France for at least the same period of time. You know, the French people, absolutely, particularly down south, are a mixed race people with blacks, for sure, from the Moors, etc. Same was in Spain, although Spain doesn't play that game up to now. Spain is much more egalitarian because it's come to terms with that. Maybe because the blacks don't show up so much in them, but they are mixed, and if you do the DNAs, you see it for sure, as would the French and the Portuguese, etc. And obviously the Italians would see that. When you start looking at DNA, and you do see it when you look at DNA, you know, for the Moorish invasions of that. So what I'm saying is that if the correct history isn't told about racial matters, about ethnic matters, let's use that terminology, then you can be on a hiding to nothing when you use ethnicity to split up your country in order for you to rule it. So my argument is Farage. My argument is Bardnap, Kimi Bardnap. My argument is you can see it with a plethora of people of Asian heritage who've gone into both the Tory party on the right-wing side and into both of Farage's old and new party. You begin to see it in Germany very clearly in AfD. You can see it in, even Meloni in Italy. You Northern Italian against Southern Italian, so black. The mixed race against a less mixed race. You can see it basically all over, and absolutely in the United States, and probably even most dangerously in the United States, because in the United States, the military component racial makeup in the United States, is actually very strongly in favour of blacks and Hispanics. Now, presently they're split, but if they came together, you'd have well-trained ex-military personnel, if they felt that they were under pressure against, some people who are trying, like Trump, trying to push forward a white agenda and bring it back to the old days of the actually anything below the 70s, where blacks basically were treated as third-class citizens, Hispanics second-class citizens, whites top. And of course, in reality, in all of those circumstances, all of them were being fooled: white, black, Hispanic. I'm using that terminology, people of colour, people of less colour, all being fooled, because the whole point of it all was that the wealthy man and woman was using this in order that they keep and create their wealth for themselves. Because you tell that geezer that he's better than the fellow below him, you don't need to pay him as much money as the fellow below him, because you're paying the fellow below him even less money. So you can push his salary down and push him down. So this is how it was played. And this is why many of the politicians do it. But many of the people who are the industrialists behind the politicians, the geopolitical movers and shakers who are doing this, are creating this because actually it means they need to put out less money in order to get the labour forces that they require. And so this is often played in that vein. And if you're not understanding that, you're being fooled and you're not seeing the way forward. If you say to the British working class man and woman, they're nicking all your jobs, when in reality, the people they're saying are nicking their jobs are been British citizens forever and a day, English forever and a day, and they're working in, say, McDonald's. But the geezer who doesn't want to work in McDonald's, who is a white-looking Brit, say, well, you should be able to get all the jobs you want to get, but he don't want to do the McDonald's job, because he wants more than that. So this is how you can play on that and say, well, he's nicking all your jobs, and you could have a better job if it wasn't for them in, the NHS or wherever it might be. The fact that the people are required is problematic, but it doesn't make it, because it doesn't, it's the easy Farage story, isn't it? It's 3 million of them here, foreigners, whomever they are, however you're classing them. 3 million of them here, 3 million people who require employment. So you fool the people by saying, you require employment, these folk are taking it. You don't ask the question whether these folk are capable of doing it without the other people, whether they've got the same skills, whether it undermines your nation because these other people who've got the skills and then improve their national capacity are gone, etc., etc., etc. It's just an easy mathematical formulae, which people use who are in reality charlatans. And so that's what you're getting. But I think it's always, repeat, always a dangerous game, whomever plays it, whatever so-called race plays it. It's a dangerous game, and that game will haunt you. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Hope you've understood what I've tried to explain by using the South African state as an example of it, but of how it's feeding into many other states, particularly within Europe and the United States, etc. And hopefully, taking all that into account, you will listen to us again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.